all of you are distinguished. God says every son of Adam is honorable and noble. So I salute all you honorable, noble people and say to you, Happy Savior's Day.
All right, Happy Savior's Day. Now, you know, I like to ask questions. I like to, test your history. So we're gonna ask some questions, this year's Savior's Day. So don't be scared to raise your hand. But if you've been in the community too long, I might have to cheat and not ask you because you walk in history. So I'm gonna have to ask somebody who looks like they may not have been around too long. But inshallah, we're gonna have some questions and answers. So we're gonna have some fun, inshallah. So at this point, I would like to bring forth Mayor Derek Armstead, who is the mayor of the City of Linden, New Jersey. Mayor Derek Armstead.
Assalamu alaikum. And happy Savior's Day to everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank Imam Mohammed for inviting me. I've known Imam Mohammed for over 10 years. He's been calling me mayor long before I became mayor. So I guess he prophesied that. But I got news for him. My grandmother told me when I first got elected I was going to be Linden's first black mayor. And I was so young I really didn't understand it, but I am Linden's first black mayor. And I'm very thankful. I'm very thankful for it. Now, when I first spoke to Imam Mohammed about coming here, I asked him, well, what do I talk about? And he says, talk about anything. And anything. He said, I said, how long? He says, 20 minutes. He says, tell your story, your life story. So you guys just get prepared. You're going to be here for a couple of hours. My story starts out, I would say, in the early 1900s, okay? It starts out in Virginia. When my grandfather, his name was Henry Creed Armstead, he shot somebody's dog. Okay, oh, this is a true story now. And I thank God for the stories that my grandparents have given me and the things they have instilled upon me, because it's these stories that kind of like carry me on and keep me going. I've been blessed to hear all those stories. And they made me the person who I am, and they made us the family who we are. God-fearing people. My grandfather used to always tell my uncles, don't call me from jail. Don't call me from jail, I'm not coming. Respect your elders, respect people in general. And my grandmother taught me, she used to always say, save your money, honey. She used to always say it. That was her favorite saying. And believe me, it paid off. Because I would not be here had it not been, I'm going to say my grandmother and grandfather, but it was my grandmother who had that wisdom to save those coins. So, back to Henry Creed, who shot and killed a dog, okay? We had an uncle named Wallace. We called him Uncle Wally. Uncle Wallace was burned as a child. He was disfigured. And my grandfather, being the oldest son, he really took care of Uncle Wallace. He treated him like he was his father, took him everywhere, and he took exception to anybody who would do anything to Uncle Wallace. So, in those days, as a family in the South, you had to work as a family just to survive. And they went from farm to farm, picking vegetables and whatever they picked down there to sustain themselves and keep their family going. And every day, this young white fellow would sick a dog on them and chase them. And one day, thankfully, that dog bit Uncle Wallace. Now, that was a good and a bad thing, because my grandfather went home, and he got his 410. He came back, and he shot the dog. Now, I don't need to tell you what happened in the early 1900s. If you couldn't even shoot a dog if you were a black man. So A lynch mob ensued, and my grandfather had to leave Virginia. Now the moral to the story is this. It wasn't just black folks who got him out of Virginia. There were some good white folks who helped him get out also, because he could have never got out without the help of the white folks in that town. Okay? Now, I heard you all talking about Newark, New Jersey. Well, guess where he wound up when he left Virginia? Newark, New Jersey. Okay? And he meets the love of his life. My grandmother, her name was Jimmy Lee Wooten. They married. He heard that there was some work in a place called Linden, New Jersey, because Linden was a very industrial-based town. So they moved to Linden. He goes to a place called DuPont. Back then, you could go to the gate of DuPont and stand out there. They would hire laborers. He told me that he went out there every day for almost a month, waiting to get hired. And then finally, one of the white gentlemen said to him, "You're here again?" And all of a sudden, he grabbed him and said, "Come on in, you can work." He said he gave him the worst job in the factory, but he took the job, and he was making $11 a week, which was a lot of money, I guess, back then. He could raise a family, and incidentally, he had 12 children. So they began living the American dream. They had children, 12 children. They start raising their children. Children get a little bit older. And finally, one day comes, they buy a home. It was like a 3-family unit. It's right down at the base of the refinery that most of us would know as Exxon, but now it's Phillips 66. Okay? And when they moved next door to a family named the Macawickis. And my grandmother told me that Macawicki went uptown and told the folks in City Hall to lower my taxes because the blacks that moved next door, he wasn't so kind with the word. He said, the black folks to move next door. So, as my grandmother would say it, she says, didn't Macawicki get sick? Macawicki got sick, and I guess when you get sick, color doesn't really play such an important role anymore. So, my grandmother, always very wise to save money. The kids were getting older, the boys were out shining shoes. She said every night my grandfather would come home, she'd rifle through his pockets and take every dime he had out of it. It was only change. And she said she'd walk right up to the bank. She said the first time she walked to the bank, she only had a little bit of change on her. She said they looked at her like she was from another planet. She said, but after about a couple of months of her going up to the bank, she said that she became Mrs. Armstead. They were just happy to see her because now she said she had a little nest egg. So she tries to convince my grandfather to buy this house. And my grandfather says it's a bad idea. We buy that house, we'll lose the one we have. My grandmother says, no. She says, but right here at the mouth of a refinery, all those transient workers will rent the property out. It'll pay for itself. He would have no parts of it. So by this time, one of her oldest daughters gets married, and she says, she goes ahead and she buys the house without him. And she tells my grandfather that that's her daughter Harriet and Big Boy's house. So one day, he asked her, how's Harriet and Big Boy doing with their house? And she says, I got news for you. That's not Harriet and Big Boy's house. That's my house. And he was almost ashamed and wouldn't speak to her. Until one day, she looks outside, because when you own, it was a tremendous thing to own one house, but to be an African-American family in Linden, and now you own 2 houses, you were really doing something. And he was out there popping his suspenders and bragging to his buddies. They were saying, Henry, what a great job you did buying that house. And he said, well, I buy this one, I rent it out, we're right here at the mouth of the refinery. He says, there's transient workers, they'll pay for it for us. And my grandma looked at him and said, she called him a dirty bird. So she said after that, he started buying into the fact that, they should be buying property. So they went across the street, and they bought the property across the street, and they bought the property next door. Okay, and all of a sudden, they own property. This black family in Linden with 12 kids, who none of them had gotten in trouble, nobody was in jail, a good family, living on Southwood Avenue. And all of a sudden, you got storefronts, and people are renting from them. And now with pipe breaks, you got to call somebody to work on it. You got your own little economic engine right there in your community.
That's right.
And that's what was happening here. That was back in the 40s and 50s. And when I was born in the 60s, I started hearing people talking about the buying power that the African Americans had in this country. I think Dr. Martin Luther King compared it to the economy of Canada at the time. We spent more money as black people than the economy of Canada. And Malcolm X talked about us leaving our dollars in our community, recycling those dollars. So we understood economics for a very long time. And my grandmother certainly knew it as well. So Linden began what I would call a demographic change. Okay, and blacks started moving into Linden. And something unique happened right there where my grandfather was living. He lived in the 7th Ward, and they lived in the 7th Ward, District 2. As fate would have it, 2 white politicians, one from 7th Ward District 1 would always run against one from 7th Ward District 2. And where those black folks live? Right in 7-2. And my grandfather realized, and those white folks started coming down to him and saying, we need your support. He realized whoever he endorsed won the election. So now he put himself in a position to have some say in jobs. And back then, jobs were garbage men. You worked as a maintenance person. So he began controlling the jobs. And now, fast forward to the 60s, I'm a young man, and I'm still watching this happen. And it was a good thing, and I began to fall in love with politics, and I started getting a comprehension and an understanding of what politics could do for our community. Because the bottom line is, if our communities are going to move forward, we've got to control the jobs. We've got to control the economics. We've got to control political boards, because they're the ones who do the hiring. Now, in 1982, as a teenager, my grandmother and grandfather were committee people in 7-2. I watched them walk away from the Democratic organization and support a candidate who had no political experience because their father was my father's friend. He said, we're supporting Joe. And Joe was only a couple years older than me at the time. He was about 18 or 19 years old. And I watched him win an election for a young kid who had no political experience, and I realized the power that they had. And it was at that point that I fell in love with politics. And I vowed that someday, when I found the time, I was going to run for political office. So as time went on, I was busy with everything else. I went to school, I tried my luck at business, got a job. In 1988, I ended up purchasing my own home. I was a very young man at 25 years old. So I'm working at Prudential, right here in Newark, and I get a notice for jury duty. I go to jury duty, I buy a newspaper, and the newspaper says, John T. Gregorio is pardoned. He was our former mayor. He was an iconic figure. I mean, he was larger than life. I knew he was going to come back and run. So I went back to my office at Prudential, and I told one of my coworkers, I said, John Gregorio is going to run for mayor. I said, and I got to figure out a way to get on his ticket. To me, it was the biggest chance I had in my life to make an interest into politics in a way that I had never done before. So I went back to the job, and back then we had these dot matrix printers, and we were printing out signs, vote for Derek Armstead, and somehow we started circulating those flyers through town. And I secured a spot on John T. Gregorio's ticket. He had already picked one gentleman, but one guy on the ticket who was young, a couple years older than me, convinced him. He said, I gotta have the young guy. He said, everybody else here is 60, 50 years old. I'm in my late 30s. I need Armstead. I want the young guy. So I wound up on his ticket, and the whole slate won, with the exception of me. So I came back 3 years later, gave it a shot, and I won again. And the first thing I realized, that once I was elected, that this was not the same political organization that my grandfather was involved in. When he had the ability to get jobs, it was a different time. I had found out that working on the back of a garbage truck was commanding a decent salary. Now you had to jump through hoops to try to get an African American a job on the back of a garbage truck. Okay, and then one day, I would dare to go against the establishment and talk about these things. And then once you go against the establishment, you're an outsider. They got to get rid of you. So in 1988, no, I'm sorry, in 2008, I was thrown out of the Democratic organization because, of my philosophy and the views I had espoused. But that didn't matter to me. I ran off the line. You remember, my grandfather had 12 children. We were one of the first black families in Linden. So those 12 children, they had to marry somebody. Okay, and as fate would have it, they married other African-American families as they had moved in. So in my district, where I ran, it was considered the African-American district. And we basically told them, we will leave and Armstead will leave when we want him to go, not when you want him to go. So I became, very strong in my district. And in 2010, something very interesting happened. After sitting on council for all these years, we have a position called Council President Pro Tem. And what that means, in the absence of a mayor, you become the acting mayor. Anytime anyone would ever ask to be the Council President Pro Tem, the establishment would tell them it goes to the most senior person. Well, guess what? I was the most senior person that year. Okay? Now I bring all my children, I have 5 children, I bring all my children to see me sworn in as Council President Pro Tem, only to be embarrassed. So I left that meeting that night so upset, and I said I was going to run for Council President. Within about 2 months, my wife convinced me, why are you going to parade through Linden asking folks to vote for you for Council President? You should just run for mayor. And that's exactly what I did. I ripped up my petitions, got new ones, started filling them out. And the gentleman who was in charge of selecting me for Council President Pro Tem, I ran against him as mayor. And at the end of the night, because we had a ragtag operation, it was just me, my wife, my daughter with her 13-year-old friends, and a bunch of kids who ran a campaign. At the end of the night, we didn't even know how to get the number, so we sent my cousin down to Democratic headquarters, and I said, how's it going down there, Richie? He says, a whole lot of tight faces down here. A lot of folks looking angry. He said, I think you might have won. And that was the primary. So about 20 minutes later, my phone rings, and I see it's Robert Bunk, the gentleman I ran against. He says, Derek, I just want to call you and congratulate you. You ran a good campaign and you beat me. I said, well, thank you, Robert. I said, hope I can count on your support in November. So we move on to November. And here I am thinking that I won the primary. The Democrats are going to come full steam ahead and help me take out the independent mayor that we had, and no such luck. The cavalry never showed up. But anyway, at the end of the day, when all the votes were counted, I had won by 43 votes on the machines. So I'm thinking I'm the mayor. Only to find out the next day that we had some mysterious absentee ballots showed up. And I wound up losing by 171 votes, which essentially meant that every absentee ballot that came in, it negated the 43 that I had won by and put the other guy up by 171 votes. So that being said, I had to wait 4 years to run again. So I would figure that the Democratic organization would support me, and once again, they chose not to support me. Now mind you, in the 2010 election, they spent $200,000 trying to beat me in a primary. They spent $70,000 in the general, the independent. So once again in 2014, they don't select me. They spent $200,000 again in a primary, and I win again, against all the odds. So we go again in November, but this time I don't wait for the cavalry to show up. I stay on the ground, I campaign, but by now, something had happened in Linden. Remember those jobs I was telling you about? Well now, the people who had gotten control of my Democratic organization, not only were they denying people from my community, they were hiring outsiders. For every decent job that was being delivered was being given to an outsider. So now the message that I had that I was taking into the African American community, I was able to take it across town also and say Linden first. It wasn't no longer just a black message. It was a Linden first message. And if any job should be given out, they should be given out to Linden people. Okay, so we formed a coalition. I call it like-minded people. Okay, because the African American population, according to the 2010 census, we're only 27%. So that means somebody else had to work with me to help me get elected. Okay, and here I am. And I tell everybody, you know, when you walk into City Hall, you see all these pictures of all the past mayors. And one day my picture's going to be up there, and somebody's going to say, wow, that's the first black mayor we had here. But I tell everybody, I don't want to be remembered for being the first black mayor in this town. I want to be known as the mayor who came to this town, and I just happened to be black. And I made change, real change. Open up some doors for people who look like me and people who don't look like me, for everybody. You see, because there's no color in care.
That's right.
There's no color in care.
That's right.
And we learned, I mean, you know, as a young person, I never knew much about Islam when I was growing up. But my father told me one thing. He told me, and he wasn't a Muslim, he said, son, he said, Muslim is a religion. He said, it comes in all flavors. He says, so you conduct yourself in anything you accomplish, you try to accomplish, you know, you try to bring everybody to the table and try to unite people. Be known as a person who cares about everybody. And that will be the basis for your success. And that's what you want to be remembered by. You want to be remembered by the things that you do for all of mankind. So, now, has that been 20 minutes? And believe it or not, you know, I just jotted down a few words. I mean, I could tell you stories. I mean, I could tell you stories about the night my house burned down. And I tell everybody, I don't like to get too philosophical, but we had a fire in my house one night. These folks in Linden wanted me gone so bad from politics, they trumped up some very ugly charges against me. It did not make, it couldn't, there was a girl who worked for the Star Ledger, she wouldn't write about it. Okay? So the Star Ledger downsized, a new reporter came in, he wrote about the story. One night I took my family, my wife, my children, to a new home that I was building. And I said, why don't you guys just come hang out with me? And lo and behold, my cousin reads this article in the newspaper. He wanted to talk to me about it. He was an attorney. So I left to go down to Woodbridge to talk to him. And I didn't come back right away. I stayed for 4 hours. By the time I got back, my wife had the kids laying on the floor. And she said, I hope you had a good time. I said, why? She said, because I had to feed these kids snacks in the back to get them to go to sleep, because she couldn't drive back home because we drove in my truck. So I said, okay, honey. I'll just get up in the morning. I'll get their clothes. We'll leave from here. She says, good idea. So we all lay down and we sleep on the floor that night. This is 2008. All of a sudden, we hear banging on the door. We look outside, it's the police officer. My wife says, it's the police. She said, maybe somebody called and said, we're sleeping in here, because the house had no CO. I look outside, my father's out there also. So now I'm thinking something happened to my mother. I'm an elected official. They escorted him over. I get down to the bottom of the steps, and it was not unusual for my father to see me working on one of my properties in the middle of the night. You know, now remember, my wife's car is at the house. And he says to me, son, where's your family at? I says, why? He says, where's your family? I said, they're upstairs with me. He says, thank God. He says, your house is burning down around the corner. You see, so this evil that they had done to try to get me out of office made it to the newspaper when my cousin had read it and called me and took me away from my family just long enough so that they would be forced to stay somewhere else that night. And that's why I say, and my wife told me that night when the house burned down, she says, God's got something special for you, honey. And she told me, she said, God is setting you up to be mayor. And I tried to convince her it wasn't me, it was one of the boys, one of my sons. She said, no, honey, it's you. It's you. She said, God knows your heart. And I believe he does. Because again, I tell everybody, I'm not here just for us. I'm here for us and to teach others that together, when we move in unity and we move in a way that we want to help everybody, that we'll be successful. So God bless you all, and thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Mayor Derek Armstead. Let's give him another round of applause. About a week ago, I was at one of the Masters in Los Angeles, and I was sharing with one of former students of the Sister Claire Muhammad School that I was coming to the Savior's Day program. And they responded, they said, "What? They still do that shirt program?" And I said, "What?" Oh man, and I lit into it. I said, "Shirt, where you get that from?" And so they went to stumbling and fumbling, and I lit into them. And I explained to them, I said, "Wait a minute." I said, "Look, we can't let people out